All right, so I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. It is my really distinguished pleasure to kick us off tonight. My name is Dan Weiner. I serve as the director of the Elections and Government Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law. And I want to thank the Brademas Center for hosting this event tonight and all of you for coming. For more than 30 years, the Brennan Center has worked to reform, revitalize, and where necessary, defend our systems of democracy and justice. And key to that work right now is not just to defend democratic institutions against attack, but also push hard for solutions to make our political system more secure, more stable, more just, and more effective for all Americans. And that brings me to the subject at hand tonight. Political debates today tend to focus on the president and to some extent to the Supreme Court. And those institutions are very important. But it really is striking in comparison to those other branches of government, how little we talk about Congress. Congress, not the president, not the Supreme Court, was intended by the framers to be the first branch of our government. It was, and I had to write this down in the words of James Madison, in a Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. And it is striking in many respects how far we have gotten from that vision. On issue after issue, we see Congress failing to respond to encroachments on its authority by the other branches, and even more importantly, failing to tackle the big problems that really only it can develop effective solutions for. So in short, the title of, as the title of my distinguished colleague Maya Kornberg's book puts it, Congress is stuck. And we are here tonight to talk about this timely subject, and I hope, what can we do to unstick Congress? And to join Maya in the discussion, I cannot think of a better interlocutor than former Congressman Derek Kilmer. During his years in the House, Mr. Kilmer led efforts to modernize the House of Representatives, working across party lines and making real measurable changes in the lives of members and also their staff. He also stands out as someone who has worked a lot with the Hill as one of the most serious policymakers that certainly we at the Brennan Center have ever worked with on a host of issues, including those that are fundamental to our democracy, including in particular, close to my heart, the role of money in the political process. And we're so delighted also to now have him as a civil society colleague at the Rockefeller Foundation. So without further ado, I know, very, very excited to hear this conversation, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Maya and Derek.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everyone for coming. And thanks for the introduction. Maya said I could do an introduction after the introduction. So I should start off by acknowledging that I have a conflict of interest here. I blurbed this book. I'm pretty sure that either Maya found my review genuinely compelling, or when trying to find someone to interview her, thought Kilmer's not doing anything. So I can't tell which. So as was mentioned, I chaired the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which was nicknamed the Fixed Congress Committee. The NYU refused to hang the Mission Accomplished banner behind us. When I joined Congress I was a member of the class of 2012, which we'll get to. I was conscious that I was joining an institution that was, according to polling, less popular than head lice, colonoscopies, and the rock band Nickelback. That's not a ranking that you want to be near. And the Fixed Congress Committee passed 202 recommendations. We may talk about some of those. About 2/3 of them have now been implemented, and Congress is still less popular than Nickelback. I actually asked the House chaplain at one point during, I think it was the 15th round or so of votes for Speaker of the House. I stopped her on the House floor and I said, "Pray harder." And she put her hand on my elbow and said, "Just imagine how messed up this place would be if I wasn't praying so hard." So that's basically how I look at reform. And that brings me to Maya's book, which is either the most important book about Congress that I've read in years, or a thorough academic explanation of how everything I spent 12 years doing was probably futile. I'm choosing to read it as the former. Maya's book is called Stuck, which in Washington, D.C., both describes the legislative process and my commute here this evening. The subtitle is How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. I read that and thought, that's not a subtitle. That was my Google Calendar in 2023. But what makes this book special is not just Maya's diagnosis of the problem. She actually offers a path forward, which means she is both smart and optimistic. So let's dive in. We were talking in the green room, I am a fan, I'm a music fan. I'm a fan of Talking Heads. In the song Once in a Lifetime, David Byrne sings, you may ask yourself, how did I get here? So Maya, to start off, how did Congress get stuck?
Great question. And first of all, thank you so much for being in conversation with me tonight and for all the work that you have done and continue to do to unstick all the things that are broken. It's truly an honor to be here with you. And thank you, Dan, for your kind words. Thank you all for being here tonight. As you mentioned, the title of the book, Stuck, speaks to what I think a lot of us are feeling right now. That Congress is stuck, that in so many ways our democracy is not delivering for ordinary Americans in the way that it was designed to do. And so my book is an attempt to look backward in order to chart a course forward. So it's a 50-year story that starts in 1974 with the Watergate babies, as they were known, and the Watergate scandal, and continues to today and documents how these forces, the relentless fundraising pressure, the mounting violence, and the distortive lens of social media have made it so much harder to make change today in Congress than ever before. And I think the urgency of a conversation about how to unstick Congress could not be more important in light of the executive abuse of power and everything that we're seeing that makes it so important to figure out how to unstick Congress so that it can stand up and deliver for the American people in the way that it was intended to. So to your question, I'm a firm believer that we need to understand how we got here in order to understand how to move forward, and that's what the book tries to do. So
you mentioned this sort of 50-year look back, and I wanted to dive in on that. As a member of the congressional class of 2012, I was a little bit bummed to learn that we were not considered one of the transformative classes. You rather, in the book, you highlight the Watergate babies, you highlight the class of 1994 and the Gingrich Revolution. You highlight recently the class of 2018 in Congress as transformative. And I thought it'd be, in the book you touch on this, but maybe share for the audience, what allowed those classes to break through the stuckness?
So, as I mentioned, it's a book about change making. And so in wanting to write a book about change making, I anchored the book in these 3 wave elections because these were 3 of the largest groups of new members that came to Congress over the past 50 years. And I'm a believer that Congress is perhaps the most malleable, the most changeable when there are new people who come in with the energy and the drive to change it. And it is also anchored in these classes because these are 3 classes that are tied, each one of them, to impeachment proceedings in different ways. And they are, I would say, inflection points in Congress's relationship vis-a-vis the executive, and also allow for the book to tell a story about how that relationship has changed and how Congress has, I would argue, been ceding power to the executive for decades now, and we're just seeing that accelerated with the current presidency.
I learned something in your book, and that is that in the class of 74, freshman members were actually made committee chairs. Freshman members, by and large, just for, your primary role is that of potted plant, right? You do a fair amount of fundraising. You're sort of auditioning for better assignments. So, as you diagnose the challenge, is how much of the the inertia against reform is rank and file members or committee chairs or leadership, or is it all three?
So one of the different kind of strands of the book, the 50-year stories that it tells, is a story of how Congress has changed so dramatically as an institution. So as you were saying, 50 years ago, the way that power was organized in Congress looked very, very different. And as a result of some of the changes that the book documents in the 70s and the 90s, and even more recently, what we've seen is that power has become increasingly centralized in party leadership. So rather than the kind of schoolhouse rock version of how a bill becomes a law that we all learned in high school, where it's introduced and then referred to committee and then deliberated on and then there's a vote, right now we have a system where frequently bills are pushed down by leadership, sometimes written with the help of some lobbyists, and members have to vote, and sometimes they're saying they don't even have a chance to read the bill before they vote on it, let alone deliberate and contribute and mark up and everything. And so I would argue that that's a really problematic situation, because right now, we're in the midst of a midterm season. There's a lot of energy going into who we elect to Congress. But we need to think about whether or not they have power to actually make the change that we're electing them to make the day after the election. And if they don't have time to read a bill before they have to vote on it, then I would argue that our Congress needs to be reorganized in a way that amplifies the power of the members that we elect.
One of the other threads that you pull in the book is around the rise of the performative culture in Congress. And some of my former team members are here. I was not a viral phenomenon in Congress. For the audience members here, hi, I'm Derek Kilmer. You likely didn't see me on cable television. We always joked on our team, if I were going to have as a sort of pragmatic left of center moderate, I would have a rally on the steps of the Capitol where I would chant, "What do we want?" And everyone would yell, "A comprehensive approach to job creation that would include workforce development, infrastructure investment, and a smarter approach to taxes and trade." And then I'd yell, "When do we want it?" And everyone would yell, "We're willing to work in a collaborative way that brings people together." No one comes to my rallies, right? Like, that's not a viral phenomenon. We joked on the modernization committee, like we would get booked on cable news, and my line to my team was always, "You want to bet?" Because we would always get bumped for the outrage of the day. So my question is it possible for a reformer to use the megaphone, to use that, this movement toward performative culture, I don't think is going to change, but can you use that megaphone to drive reform, to unstick Congress, or does the use of the megaphone inevitably drive more dysfunction?
So I think that it's an issue that we've been needing to reckon with since television cameras were introduced into Congress in the 80s. And Newt Gingrich is known to have made speeches to an empty floor because he knew that someone on C-SPAN was watching. So this incentive structure that, as Representative Lauren Underwood, who I also interviewed for the book, called an incentive structure that is about eyeballs and acclaim rather than substantive policymaking, I think is one that we need to reckon with. And then the book takes on as something that is complicated, especially in the context of needing transparency and of wanting social media as a tool for political engagement as we've seen it be used. And so to your question, I think that this kind of prophetic power, the megaphone power of social media can be used to draw attention, to elevate not just the public profile of members of Congress, but also raise public awareness about issues. So for example, the book tells a story about how former member Henry Waxman, who was in Congress for 4 decades, in the 80s, when the AIDS epidemic was ravaging the country, and while President Reagan would not even say the word AIDS, Henry Waxman was holding committee hearings about topics that no one wanted to talk about, that were not getting attention, topics like injection drugs and anal and oral sex and sex work. He was holding hearings about those things to draw attention to them. He was inviting celebrities to testify in hearings because he knew that would draw attention. And that was one of many tools and strategies that he used to guard funding for AIDS research and fight for healthcare and access to healthcare in this country. More recently, we've seen folks like Lauren Underwood, who I just mentioned, using sound bites from questioning of the Secretary of Homeland Security about why family separation was happening at the border, and using her background working in healthcare as a nurse to ask some incisive questions. So it's a tool for public awareness, and it's a powerful tool. But when we have an incentive structure where we also have stories like Representative Joe Wilson yelling "You lie" in the middle of Barack Obama's joint address to Congress in 2009, and having, raising so much money off of that clip, we have to ask ourselves, what is this encouraging? And when we know that the media tends towards the most salacious, sometimes most negative angle, like you were saying, then that's I think perhaps further contributing to the crisis of public trust that we have in Congress. So I think it's really a double-edged sword that is important to reckon with.
I think we were talking about this in the green room. Like, one of the things that's sort of tragic comic about the dynamic is junior members use social media because they don't have committee power, and often their use of trying to drive that viral content makes substantive work harder in committees, because committees become a place where people show up so that they can film their 5-minute clip to throw up on social media rather than for legislating.
Yeah, and I think that when you throw fundraising into the mix, it makes it even harder. Yeah. Because right now we're seeing not just this relentless pressure to fundraise, but also fundraising is increasingly happening online. It's increasingly nationalized. And so, as I mentioned, this soundbite moment yelling "You lie" in the middle of a joint address to Congress can be used as a fundraising tool. And so, again, I think that it's not just sometimes counterproductive to the sometimes, not so salacious and not so theatrical work that is necessary to pass legislation, which you know because you did so much of it, but also I think speaks to the real distortive power of money in politics, and the way in which these soundbite moments people are increasingly reliant on in order to fundraise to get reelected, and also to build power within the chamber once they're elected.
So let's stay on the theme of money. I think most Americans are conscious of their political candidates raise money. They run TV ads that say paid for by people, I think what your bill sort of opens the curtain on is some other elements of money in politics that the American public probably isn't as familiar with. Things like leadership PACs, things like the expectation that members of Congress pay dues to the party organization. So how do you maybe share a little bit about what that is, and how do you see that impacting congressional dysfunction?
So we're in the midst of another midterm election cycle, and I'm sure that all of us are seeing headlines about how it's breaking records yet again for fundraising. And the book starts in 1974, and it tells a story of how dramatically the landscape of money in politics has changed in just 5 decades. So in 1976, the Supreme Court Buckley v. Vallejo decision rules that spending limits are unconstitutional in campaigns, and money starts to flood campaigns. And this is accelerated with the 2010 Citizens United decision that allows unlimited outside spending in campaigns. And we hear a lot about how prohibitive that is for candidates running for office, and how much that distorts the kind of pipeline. But as you're saying, there's not as much awareness of how money is actually distorting pathways to power and lawmaking itself once people are elected. So in 1976, the Buckley v. Vallejo decision happens, and the book tells, one of the stories that it tells is of Henry Waxman again, understanding that money is the name of the game, and he represents Beverly Hills, a safe and very wealthy district. And he starts what's called the leadership PAC, so that he can donate more money to other members in his campaign to become a committee chair. He does successfully become a committee chair, and indeed, leadership PACs become a tool for members to curry favor and build clout within the chamber, and now almost every member of the House has one. There's also now the expectation that members will pay dues to the party in order to win committee leadership positions or win party leadership positions. And so there's a story in the book of Representative Marcia Fudge saying to a staffer that she doesn't know how she's going to leverage the working class community that she represented in order to pay dues to the party, which to me is shocking. This is not a member saying, I don't know how I'm going to raise the money that I need to get reelected. It's a member saying, how am I going to raise money in order to get on the committee that I want, in order to pay dues to the party, in order to build power once I'm elected. And so clearly the system is recreating structural disadvantages that groups with less access to wealth face in running for office, and I think is extremely distortive to the legislative process.
Another dynamic that you mentioned that is distortive to the process is violence. Mm-hmm. And Lord knows we've seen a lot of that in recent years. Even recently at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, we were talking in the green room about not my favorite topic, the 6th of January. Yeah. But you point out that it is not just a safety issue, but that it distorts lawmaking. And I was sharing with you, I remember casting a vote on a bill after having had my office picketed, my home picketed, and my kids' elementary school protested. And afterwards, one of my colleagues came up to me and said, man, I totally agree with your vote, but I could never have done that because I think I would have gotten killed. And so how do you see that fear of retaliation, not just, from the other side of the aisle, but potentially from your own party, specifically impacting how people legislate, their willingness to make bipartisan compromise? How does violence play a role in the legislative process?
So first of all, I'm really sorry that you had to go through that and that so many public figures and electeds in our country are subjected to violence and threats and harassment. And it speaks to your courage and the courage of others to continue to serve our country in the face of these threats and harassment. And this should not be normalized. And we are becoming too accustomed to these violent acts. And so in the midst of this rise in threats and violence against members of Congress, and between 2018 and 2023, according to U.S. Capitol Police data, the number of threats of violence and incidents of violence against members of Congress doubled. The book talks about 3 central ways that this is distorting lawmaking. So firstly, there's a public attrition problem. Members are saying, is it worth it to put myself and my family at risk for this job? And the book quotes Nancy Pelosi's memoir, where she says that when she talks to young dynamic people, especially women, thinking of running for Congress, what they tell her is that what happened to Paul Pelosi, referencing the violent attack against her husband, Paul Pelosi, in their San Francisco home, that what happened to Paul Pelosi is their greatest fear. It's the biggest deterrent to them running. And there are so many stories of this, and we just have to look at the wave of retirements from Congress right now and see what a pipeline issue this is. So the second way that the book talks about violence distorting the legislative process is that members not only are leaving public office, but they're afraid to engage with their constituents. The book quotes Representative Scanlon saying, how could we not have what happened to Gabby Giffords, the 2011 shooting of Gabby Giffords, at a Congress at Your Corner event? How could we not have that in the back of our minds when we're doing a Congress at Your Corner event? And recently we saw Representative Ilhan Omar attacked at a town hall. So members are canceling town halls. There's one member who told me that there's parts of her own district that she doesn't go to because she does not feel safe. So we're in a representative democracy where our representatives are afraid to engage with the constituents that they represent, and that is hugely problematic. And lastly, and I think this speaks to your point on building bipartisan consensus on issues that matter to the American people, members are saying that they're afraid to vote their conscience, that they're afraid to take on hot button issues because they're afraid of violence. There's a quote in the book from Liz Cheney saying that she knows Republican members that have come and said to her, I would have voted to impeach the president, but I was afraid for my safety or the safety of my family, which is shocking. And I think that should continue to shock us. And in research that we've done in the Brennan Center about violence faced by state and local office holders, we hear the same thing. I had one state lawmaker tell me that she cares a lot about gun control, but she did not take that on as an issue when her sons were young, because she was afraid of violence that they would face. So it's an issue at every level of government, not just in Congress. And I think it's a huge danger to the future of our democracy, and it could not be more urgent for us to continue to fight against.
You just touched on like a discomfort with taking difficult votes because of potential for violence. I want to take a different angle on that. And that is, in your vote, you talk about basically when the legislative branch creates a vacuum, it's filled by the executive branch, sometimes by the court. And I think here's what I want to know. Is Congress doing that intentionally? Are members saying, I don't want to have to make hard decisions, so I'm just going to cede authority to the courts, I'm going to cede authority to the executive branch? Is it an abdication, or is it something that's being done to Congress? Is it skill or will?
Well, I'm going to answer that, and then I'd be curious for your perspective as someone who was just there living it. But what I can say kind of from the historical perspective here, and as a political scientist studying Congress, is that this is not a result of something that happened yesterday. I see it as a decades-long process where Congress has been ceding power, as I mentioned earlier. In the 90s, one journalist said that Congress was self-lobotomizing itself because what it did was to defund an entire congressional support agency, the Office of Technology Assessment, that used to help Congress understand science. It cut funding dramatically to other support agencies, to committee staff, and really gutted Congress. And now what we have is a Congress where there's several thousand fewer staff members than there were a few decades ago. And so how can we expect Congress to be standing up when it has so much less funding than the executive branch, by some accounts 120 times less funding than the executive branch, when it has such a dearth of access to expertise and to the brain power that it needs in order to be conducting effective oversight. So I think that understanding that historical perspective, again, of how we got here, leads me to one conclusion, which I continue to argue for, and which the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress made such an effective case for, which is that Congress needs to resource itself in order to stand up and in order to do its job effectively for the American people. And as I mentioned, I am very curious for your perspective as someone who was there for over a decade seeing this process happen.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, right? I think you're dead on target in terms of just the capacity of the institution to do hard things has been limited by lack of investment in the institution, which is why the Modernization Committee elevated building capacity of the institution so significantly. It's really hard to do cutting edge innovation policy when I got to Congress, I was handed a pager. And Congress is described as an 18th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems, right? It is an institution that by choice and by neglect has diminished in its capacity to take on hard problems. And there were times where the institution chose to punt because it was easy to punt, right? And I can think of times where and where it was most pronounced was on budget issues, where you saw, and one of the things that the Modernization Committee did was to restore some of the Article I authorities to the Congress with regard to the power of the purse. And yet, every time there's a government shutdown, every time there is a continuing resolution, Congress is in essence ceding authority. On war powers in particular, I think it is pronounced the degree to which Congress has, I think, largely by choice handed power to the executive branch because it doesn't want to take tough votes on those issues.
Yeah.
Let's stick on this question of Article 1 and the ceding of authority. You point to the Watergate class of 74 as a group that specifically pushed back against executive overreach with regard to the Vietnam War, with regard to Watergate. What specific legislative tools did they use to reclaim the power that today's stuck Congress have not been able to use?
Mm-hmm. So it's exactly the issues that you were just referencing. They were actually standing up and legislating in a way that was, that was intended to reclaim congressional power. So, for example, with war powers, at the tail end of the Vietnam War, Congress passes the 1973 War Powers Resolution, which aims to take back some of the war powers that President Nixon was usurping during the Vietnam War. Congress passes the 1974 Impoundment Control Act to try to reclaim some of the power of the purse that the president has taken. And what we've seen now is that we have these laws, but the president is manipulating loopholes in the Impoundment Control Act. And right now, in trying to reclaim these same authorities, Congress can rely on these existing examples, existing statutes, and strengthen them. And I would argue that we need to. We need to be revisiting the War Powers Resolution and strengthening it. We need to be revisiting the Impoundment Control Act and strengthening it. Congress right now doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. Some of the bedrock is there. And it needs to be strengthened to account for the ways in which, again, things have fallen through the cracks when there's areas of the statute that are vague and can be manipulated. So again, I think that it speaks to Congress having the impetus to stand up, and it gives us, real legal basis that we can go back to and strengthen in a desire to once again strengthen congressional authority and make sure that Congress can stand up as a branch.
One of the ways Congress steps up as a branch is oversight. You mentioned Henry Waxman a couple times. He wrote the book on oversight. Oftentimes, it seems like oversight is used more to score political points than to actually provide oversight of the executive. So what's going on there? I mean, it feels like hearings are more to, again, try to drive a viral clip, to embarrass the other side. Seldom, although there are circumstances where there are exceptions to it, seldom does a party in power provide oversight of its own party. Mm-hmm. How do you diagnose that problem, and how should that be fixed?
So I think that has to be viewed in the kind of broader context of some of the things that we were talking about. And I certainly don't have the silver bullet for it. But I think we can, again, look to some of the historical stories of how we got here. So in the early 80s, as I mentioned, television cameras are introduced in Congress, and Sandra Day O'Connor becomes the first nominee who has televised confirmation hearings. And I was actually looking at some of the articles written about those confirmation hearings, and the journalists were saying things like, oh, they were just asking rambling questions that seemed to have more to do with getting attention for themselves and less to do with asking her a question. And I think that's the point. You put on a show when you know that someone's watching. And Newt Gingrich, who I have also mentioned a few times, he is known to have said, the media loves fights. And so we're going to give them fights. And so, again, I think that it speaks to this problematic incentive structure that the media is a part of, where if what sells and what literally helps you fundraise and what helps you get attention online and elevate your public profile is the most negative, most salacious thing, then that's going to drive more theatrical committee hearings, whether they be on oversight or on other things. And certainly confirmation hearings, we've seen that be the case, and we've seen that change dramatically since the 80s and since those first hearings when the journalists were so surprised that is what the questions looked like. So again, I think that it is great that we have a transparent Congress where members of the public can engage with it, but we need to try to, and this is one of the things that you all did so well with the Select Committee on Modernization of Congress, we need to try to also create other spaces where members can interact with each other across party lines, and staff can interact, and it not just be in these kind of theatrical, grandiose committee hearing moments.
We tried
right?
to make the Modernization Committee viral. We were on C-SPAN 8.
Well, I have a question for you,
Yeah.
though. Do you think that part of the reason that you were effective in the current context is because you weren't getting so much media attention? Because the media attention would have naturally kind of had people, again, tend towards perhaps more salacious behavior?
Yeah, I'm not sure that was... we would have loved to have had a little bit more attention to the topic of modernization and reform. Our theory going in was if you want things to work differently in Congress, do things differently in Congress. So we did a bunch of stuff very differently. We had an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. We had a joint staff. We didn't split the budget in half and hire half a group to wear blue shirts and half a group to wear red.
You had alternated seating.
We sat Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. So when someone came to testify in front of our committee, you lean over to the person next to you and say, that was kind of interesting. What do you think of that? And you always lean over next to someone from a different party. We didn't sit on a dais. We sat around a round table because I've never had a good conversation speaking to the back of somebody's head. We had meals together. We tried to actually, find new ways of collaborating, which is pretty foreign, I think, in the institution.
Unfortunately.
Why do you think that's foreign in the institution?
Well, first of all, I always give some of the examples of the Modernization Committee in terms of just like the sitting around a round table or alternating seated to make the point that these are humans that we're talking about. And when we think about what can build human relationships, the same rules apply. So, historically, when we think about how we got here, we can look to points in time like the 90s when Republicans retook the House after 40 years of Democratic control, and the Republican leadership at the time really encouraged members to no longer live in Washington, D.C., to live in the districts. And so, therefore, to no longer have the opportunities to send their kids to the same school and to go to the same gym and interact kind of outside of work in the way that you need to build these relationships. And so that's why I think that spaces like the ones that you guys created and were advocating for are so much more important in the context of a Congress in which members no longer live in Washington, D.C. for the most part.
So let me ask you one more question, and then we'll take a few audience questions, and then I'll take prerogative to give you the final question, and then we'll say goodnight. So I'm going to go full Hogwarts here on you. I give you a magic wand, one reform implemented tomorrow. What would it be, and why does it have the best chance of actually breaking the logjam?
It would be for Congress to handle exactly what I just mentioned, which is that it is dramatically under-resourced and not organized for success. When we have a Congress that has so few staff and access to skills and expertise, when we have a Congress who the last time that it reorganized its committee jurisdictions was in the 1970s before the internet existed, we shouldn't be surprised that it can't do things like regulate the tech industry. We shouldn't be surprised that members are Googling answers to complex policy questions or asking AI increasingly instead of really going to expert sources and being able to engage in the way that they need to. So we need to dramatically increase staffing and other resources. And this includes making Congress more accessible to people. Frequently when I talk about the book, and of course it's titled Stuck, so I'm not arguing that everything works, but I try to make the point of how important it is to engage with Congress. Because what I see when I talk to people is that with this crisis of public trust that you were mentioning at the outset, that people are just drawing back. They're increasingly disengaged. They say, what's the point of engaging with an institution that doesn't listen to me? And so we need to be engaging with Congress. We need to be engaging, especially now, to unstick it. And so Congress needs to make it easier. It needs to, allow witnesses to testify virtually. It needs to make it easier for folks to handle constituent service requests. It needs to make it easier for members of the public to engage with Congress in field hearings and online and in other spaces. That's how we regain public trust and how we show people that Congress is listening. But I would actually, sorry, before we go to audience questions, I've been waiting to ask you what you think as someone who really led an effort, a successful effort to wave so many different magic wands that have changed Congress. What do you think is left to do now for kind of the future of the Modernization Committee, which is now, it's worth mentioning, a permanent subcommittee of the House Administration Committee?
So let me hit two topics. One is some of the will problems.
Mm-hmm.
So the will problems, I think, are driven by things like money and primaries and gerrymandering.
Mm-hmm.
This is just Eric talking, not my employer. I think primaries are a big deal. They came up a lot. The number of times I had colleagues say, man, I would work with you on that, but I'd probably eat it in a primary, was substantial.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think the states that have top two primaries or open primaries or instant runoff voting or what have you, I think you see members somewhat liberated by that.
Mm-hmm.
And it changes how people campaign, which I think is not so bad. So that's one. The other is on the capacity issue, which is the hardest thing in trying to drive additional capacity into Congress is it's a deeply unpopular institution. So it's hard as a member of Congress to stand up and say, let's resource this deeply unpopular institution. So part of the conversation that we, as the Modernization Committee, had with one another and with the folks on C-SPAN 8 was when you don't resource it, that's when bad things happen.
Right.
Because the consequence of that is your elected officials are less capable of solving problems for the American people. When you don't resource it, nature abhors a vacuum, and that vacuum is filled by lobbyists. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't serve the best interests of the American people. So we had everybody on the committee sort of virtually tattoo themselves with the phrase, to make Congress work better for the American people, right? If you're going to add capacity, you have to be able to make the argument that it is to make the institution work better for the American people.
Right.
It can't be so that you can have a snazzy looking office, right? Or that you have, something that serves you. Part of the reason that the lobotomization of the institution occurred was because Congress was unpopular. Mm-hmm. And so it was popular to say, and we're going to cut it in half, right? We're going to cut committee funding. We're going to cut member office funding. We're going to self-flagellate. That will make us more popular. When I became, I'm sorry to opine on this for a bit. I hope it's interesting, but and then we'll take audience questions. When I became chair of the Modernization Committee, someone gave me a speech from John Gardner, mm-hmm. who had been the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under Lyndon Johnson. And he was talking about the declining faith in institutions in the 60s. We've seen further decline in faith in institutions. But he talked about the importance of being what he referred to as a loving critic of an institution. He said institutions suffer from uncritical lovers who deny an institution the sort of life-giving improvement that's required. And he said institutions also suffer from unloving critics that treat the institution like the piñata at the party, mm-hmm. and seek to tear it down. And so one of the things that I tried to do as a member and as the leader of the Modernization Committee was to approach the work as a loving critic of the institution. And I think that, if I could do one thing, would be to try to encourage both members and citizens to be loving critics of the institutions that we hold dear.
Yeah,
So let's open it up.
more.
Anybody have questions? We've got someone with a microphone, so they'll make their way over to you.
Thank you. I often tell my students that one of the big problems with the Congress is that we've seen this dramatic decline in what's oftentimes referred to as institutional patriotism, which manifests itself in large part their unwillingness to take on the executive branch. My problem always is that after I describe the issue in these terms, they always ask me, well, how are we going to fix it? And at that point, I really don't have much of an answer for them. And I'm wondering what your answers are for them.
You wrote the book.
You know, I think that, as you're saying, it is kind of a cyclical problem. And it's a vicious cycle. And I actually love what you were saying about being a loving critic, because I think that one of the worst things that we can do, and what I see also when I engage with students, is people who say, what's the point of engaging because no one's listening to me? I think we see this kind of more broadly in American politics. And so I think that anything that we can do to show people that their voice matters would help to make the case for more reform. So I come from the international development world, actually. I used to work with international legislatures. And one of the examples that I always give is in Wales, they have a program called You Said We Did, where when there is a civic engagement process, when elected officials go out into the community and they say, we want to hear your voice, then they show people what they did with their feedback. What I see with so many structures of American government, and that is Congress, but that also extends to even things like local community boards, is there, you know, people go out into the community, they say, we want to hear you, or we need you to come donate to us or listen to us when we're campaigning. And then there's no feedback loop. So one of the things that I think that we just need to structurally embed, especially in something that is meant to be the people's branch, is a feedback loop for a continuous conversation, which is what I see democracy as, a continuous conversation between electeds and their constituents. That I think is a kind of bigger structural issue that we have to fix. And I'm curious what your answer to the question would be as well.
I may take a slightly different angle on it. When we stood up the modernization committee, the first thing we did was had a bipartisan planning retreat, and we invited the Democrats and the Republicans on the committee to the Library of Congress for basically most of a day. And the first thing we asked was, why did you come to Congress, and how has it met or failed to meet your expectations? And it was a stunning half hour of discussion, because you wouldn't have known who the Republicans were and who the Democrats were. And what you heard people say was things like, you know, I really thought I would come here and make a difference on behalf of my constituents, but I really am a telemarketer. I spend a lot of time raising money, and I don't really spend much time being able to do the stuff that I thought I was going to be able to do. And at some point, you know, I mentioned the adage for our committee, the ethic that we try to bring is, if you want things to work differently, do things differently, right? If you are content with the way things are, just keep at it, right? Keep doing it that way. But I don't think very many people who are in the institution think it's working the way it ought to. And at some point, the answer is to say, like, well, I have agency, right? I can actually do something about that. Whether that be trying to fix the budget and appropriations process so it's not in persistent dysfunction, or whether it's trying to restore some of the Article I authorities around things like war powers. Like, there is agency for members who don't want to play the role of potted plant, who don't want to feel like they work for Enron. It's hard to work in an institution where, when I would go grocery shopping, and inevitably people at the store would come up to me and ask me how I'm doing as though I had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. And like, that's not great, right? And so the question becomes like, so do I want to feel like I work at this place where people are like, man, I'm sorry, pal? Or do I actually want to make it something better, which is why I chose to dedicate some time to it. Other questions? I see a hand down here.
So it seems to me that our political system is set up to be corrupt. With all this money involved, and we allow people to run for years for an office, president in particular, no limit on the money. And in Congress, there was a congressman a couple of years ago who was on 60 Minutes who talked about his experience of having to go, I think he was a Republican, he had to spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week at the RNC raising money. And there just seems to be no end to the money. I mean, in Virginia, they spent over $100 million on this referendum. $10 million to defeat these Indiana legislators for no reason. I mean, just retribution, I think, more than anything. But there seems to just be an unlimited amount of money that goes to politics. And I don't know where it comes from. I guess there's just so much money in this country that there's just no end to it. But I would like to know what you think in terms of how corrupt is our political system on a scale of 1 to 10.
Well, I would just point to the fact that just a few decades ago, things were completely different. This is a direct result of Supreme Court decisions like Buckley v. Valeo, like Citizens United. One of the members that I spotlight in the 70s is Elizabeth Holtzman. She ran for Congress in Brooklyn against an incumbent, and she was told, you need to raise $100,000. She raised $30,000 and won. And that's just unfathomable right now. So this very recently was very different, and we have the power to make it different again. I think that what's going on right now speaks to the urgency of ending Citizens United. It speaks to the urgency of campaign finance reform, which we know from public opinion polling, the vast majority of Americans feel, just like you were hinting at you do, that it is unconscionable, the amount of money that is being spent right now, and that something has to change. And things that the Brennan Center has been advocating for, like small donor public financing or other policy fixes, I think go part of the way. But we need to just keep working and keep taking step by step to make sure that comprehensive campaign finance reform is happening. Because as you're saying, it's completely distortive to the process. And I also had members telling me that they're spending every mealtime dialing for dollars, and this limits the amount of time that they have to legislate, and it amplifies obviously the amount of power that moneyed interests have at the expense of the voices of ordinary Americans. So I think you're right in pointing out that it is a completely distorted system that we should not be okay with, that has to change, right?
The last point you made, I think, is the most important point you made, which is perhaps and again, I'm here in my personal capacity, so I'm only speaking for myself. The most insidious part of the role of money in politics is it makes everyday Americans feel like their voices don't count.
Exactly.
When a candidate's getting tens of millions of dollars, they're like, what are you listening to me for? You're not. And that becomes, I think, part of the spiral that we've seen where people don't feel heard. Mm-hmm. There were all sorts of campaign finance reform efforts when I was in the House, around everything from trying to create a small dollar system of public financing to trying to limit the role of super PACs, to we were talking about the Federal Election Commission and trying to reform the Federal Election Commission so that at least you could get the referee back on the field to blow the whistle on those who cheat in our political system. So there are some common sense steps to take. And I think it's, again, just speaking on my own behalf, I think it is important if we're gonna see the system improve.
What's their incentive to do it? They don't seem to want to involve.
The incentive is not dissimilar to the response that I gave to the gentleman up there, which is you don't want to work for a place that's so broken.
Well, and just to add to that, the majority of the American public wants this to change if you look at opinion polls. So you also have an incentive as an elected to be representing, what people want to have happen. We saw this with, we see this, I think, with the continued effort to ban congressional stock trading. We know that the vast majority of both parties wants this to end, and I think that if you hear what members are saying about this, I think it speaks to also what they want and also what their constituents want to see change. So it's people having an incentive, but it's also an incentive as an elected to represent what the American people want to change.
This is going to be our last audience question.
Oh, it should be not easy, but I am just really curious, Maya. Is Congress, in your opinion, today an equal branch of government?
So I think, as may have been implied by so much of what we've said, Congress has ceded a lot of the authority that it once had as an equal branch. And actually, the framers designed it to be the central branch. It is supposed to be the linchpin of our democracy, the kind of centerpiece, the people's branch. And not only has it now failed to be a co-equal branch, but as I was saying earlier, it could not be more urgent for it to step up and try to make up some of the ground that it has lost. Because when we don't have Congress acting as a co-equal branch, as it was designed, we don't have checks on executive abuse of power. We don't have checks on war powers, on spending, on other really important things. And so I think that it could not be more important right now to be thinking about unsticking Congress, not just because you love Congress, because again, most people don't, but because you want democracy to work, because that I think is inevitably something that we need Congress for.
So I want to end where your book ends, which is with hope. You say in the book, Congress is, and I'm quoting, always changeable, shaped and reshaped by the people who walk its halls. So given everything you've documented, money, the media, violence, some of the topics that we talked about tonight, what does a person need to actually believe to hold on to that hope? And do you still have it?
So I certainly have a lot of hope, and I would characterize myself, now I have words for it, as a loving critic of Congress myself. And we're sitting here in the midst of a midterm election cycle. And to me, as someone who just spent a lot of time thinking about what it means for Congress when a wave of new reformers comes in, that gives me a tremendous amount of hope. I genuinely do believe that Congress is much more malleable than people realize. And as I mentioned, just a few decades ago, it looked very different from how it looks now. And so we can change it, yet again, by electing people whose values we believe in, and by empowering them to actually have power to make change once they are elected. And so I think in this moment, especially in an election cycle, we have a lot of reasons for hope that we can once again change the institution, as reformers in 74 and 94 and 2018 and 2012 did before. And the other thing that gives me hope is the many conversations that I had with folks like Congressman Derek Kilmer for the book. The book is based on dozens of conversations with members, current and former, and I continue to be endlessly inspired by their commitment to the institution and to serving the American people. And so that continues to give me hope that we can move in the right direction, and that, again, change is much more possible than I think that we realize sometimes.
Okay, the book is stuck. And give it up for Maya Kornberg.
And Congressman Derek Kilmer, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks.